All for joining us on behalf of CFOL York, UNITAR, York Region, and the City Institute at York University. I would like to, and on behalf of the organizing committee of this series, I would like to welcome you all and thank you all the speakers and panelists for all your efforts and work toward these sessions, and we appreciate your time immensely. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is one of the key focusing areas of CFOL York. And in partnership with York Region and other stakeholders, we have at CFOL York created an advisory committee specific to safe mobility. And this series is part of that effort to merge equity, diversity, and inclusion with transportation, safety, and mobility. And we are really happy to have a very good number of speakers and panelists with us during these sessions. And I really appreciate their time. And I also would like to introduce Tia coming from York Region to welcome you on behalf of York Region at this time. Tia, please.
Thanks so much, Professor Asghari. Welcome, everyone. York Region Public Health values this partnership within CFOL York. And collectively, of course, we recognize the importance of bringing the experts to you to build capacity in our communities through the speaker series. As a public health nurse myself, working in the area of built environment, my work encompasses striving to improve community health and well-being, preventing transportation-related injuries, and reducing health inequities. This Transportation Equity and Justice series, launching today, aims to provide a space for sharing knowledge and experience and justice issues and considerations are addressed and how we address them in transportation. On behalf of CFOL York, we hope you enjoy the session and invite you to engage during the Q&A to make the most of our time together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tia. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Park and Sonia Sanita as a panelist for this session. Dr. Peter Park is an associate professor in Department of Civil Engineering at Lassonde School of Engineering at York University. His expertise is in transportation safety and security, intelligent transportation systems, transportation planning, and advanced statistical analysis. Dr. Peter Park has a long list of publications in this area, and he currently serves as an editorial board member for highly regarded transportation safety journals, including Accident Analysis and Prevention and Analytics Methods in Accident Research. Dr. Peter Park is kindly accepted to be the chair of CFOL York Safe Mobility Advisory Committee. And Sonia Sanita is a healthy built environment specialist with York Region Public Health. And as a public health practitioner, Sonia is focusing on addressing how the built environment can improve health and well-being across all ages and abilities. With training and experience in planning, public health, environmental studies, and education, Sonia is currently collaborating with regional and municipal partners as well as other stakeholders to promote complete communities. Sonia is also partnering with academia to develop educational opportunities for training on health and development. Sonia and Peter, we really appreciate your effort and all the hard work and collaboration during this past few months in establishing the Safe Mobility Advisory Committee and helping with organizing this series. Thank you very much. Peter and Sonia, floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Park. Thank you very much, Dr. Asghari, for introducing me. It is truly my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the CPAR's Transportation Equity and Justice Series, Ms. Deborah Lightman, the Senior Project Manager working in Transport and Planning Division at the City of Ottawa, for her presentation titled Incorporating Equity into Ottawa's Transportation Master Plan. Before I introducing her bio, I would want to say that the transport and equity issue, including the forthcoming transport and master plan for the city of Ottawa, was indeed used as a teaching material in my third year course titled Transport and Planning Evaluation here at York University in this term. For that, I'm personally very excited to learn more about the things associated with this important and emerging transportation equity issue directly from a manager who were participating in developing the TMP. That said, the first speaker, Deborah, is a transport and planner and policy analyst that with 10 years of experience in both the public and private sectors. She holds a master's in city planning degree from the MIT in Boston, Massachusetts, and is passionate about sustainable transportation and equitable city planning. She is currently the project manager for the update to Ottawa's transportation master plan. Since it is an ongoing project, she looks forward to receiving feedback on the proposed approaches to incorporating equity into the TMP. Welcome, Deborah, and the podium is yours now.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for having me. And did that work as a screen share? Excellent. So as Peter mentioned, we are right in the middle of this project. We started it several years ago and will continue for several more years. Everything I'm sharing today is in draft version, currently under review, out for consultation, or even some of these pieces we're talking about are upcoming. And so this type of event is great, hopefully to generate discussion, hear from others, get ideas, get questions that lead us to kind of rethink what we're doing. So looking forward to some good discussion. So kind of the City of Ottawa context that we are working in. The last transportation master plan was in 2013. And so we try to update it every 5 to 10 years. We're now kind of at the later end of that. And a lot has changed in the policy context since the 2013 transportation master plan. The City of Ottawa adopted an equity inclusion lens in 2013, informed by some of the work advancing equity and inclusion, a guide for municipalities. And more recently, just in this past November, we updated our official plan, and the equity and inclusion lens carries forward to the high-level policy statements in the official plan. That's sort of the quick policy context for the transportation master plan. So what is the TMP? It's a supporting document of the official plan. The official plan establishes some high-level goals and policies, and then the transportation master plan provides additional details about how are we actually going to achieve these goals, these objectives, what are the policies we need, what's the infrastructure we need, as well as services to meet the needs of residences and businesses. We use a planning horizon out to 2046, but we do update the transportation master plan more often. And in this new official plan, there is a sustainable transportation target that in 2046, half of all trips will be by sustainable modes. Kind of a little more detail, I guess the two big parts of the transportation master plan, a set of policies, and then also a set of infrastructure, like a capital infrastructure program to meet our transportation demand and our mode share targets. So the kind of aspect that gets the most attention is some fairly significant capital investments in transit, road projects, cycling projects, and pedestrian projects. The two maps on the screen are from the 2013 TMP. An affordable transit network was identified that was to be built out to 2030, between 2013 and 2031. And then there's also a set of road projects, new roads, road widenings generally. Again, the affordable network was identified as the projects that would be built from 2013 to 2031. As you see in the kind of table on the right, there is a lot of money on the table. These are big projects. So $864 million of road projects based on that in 2013 dollars. Over $2 billion of rapid transit projects. So for this update, in the last 2013 TMP had both the policies and the projects in a single document. This time around, we've actually split them out into two parts. We were planning to do them together originally, but the networks and projects relies on an origin destination survey that we've had to delay a couple of times due to the pandemic. And so the interesting thing about doing the policies first is that, first of all, they get more attention. And second of all, there's an opportunity to kind of pave the way for the that next phase, set out some of the principles we'll be using to develop that capital infrastructure plan, which is how we spend the money out to 2046. And also at this time, so the two pieces we're working on are a set of policies, and also the walking and cycling capital projects don't rely on that origin destination survey the same way. And that project list is due for a refresh. So we're taking the opportunity to do that at the same time. We are doing public consultation, 3 major phases of engagement. And we just actually wrapped up consultation on the draft policies and proposed walking and cycling candidate projects. For this group, what's probably of interest is that we established something called the Ambassadors Working Group with representatives of community organizations who work with or represent equity deserving groups. And we've tried to engage them at each phase. We also have a list of kind of community organizations, and we sent a couple of email blasts to those organizations to encourage them to promote the consultation to the people they work with. In particular, the active transportation projects. So those are like new sidewalks, new cycle tracks, lines on a map that are quite tangible that we expected would be the kind of the item that people would be most interested and able to weigh in on. So we did see a bit of an uptick in our consultation on those walking and cycling projects. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about how we have incorporated equity into our draft transportation master plan policies. And the 2013 TMP did not have much of a focus on equity. It's sort of the new equity inclusion lens is what kind of has brought us to thinking about this in a very deliberate way. And it has been a bit of a journey thinking through what does it mean for our transportation master plan. Kind of at a high level, our transportation master plan policies, we have about 67 policies split into 11 different themes, kind of covering the whole spectrum of transportation topics. And we also, this time around, included specific actions to try to get faster progress on some of the policies. So the things that we think we need to do next to be able to achieve these policies. Our vision and guiding principles includes that the network will provide travel options for people regardless of their income, identity, or ability. And the vision and guiding principles were developed with a lot of input from consultation. I'm going to jump into kind of the details of what we are thinking on equity and where that comes from. And I won't go I won't talk very much about the other aspects of our transportation master plan policies. So you're welcome to check it out on our website, Engage Ottawa, Transportation Master Plan Update. So kind of our starting definition is that a transportation system that is equitable enables everyone to access destinations and helps to address systemic barriers to social and economic participation. And so this kind of starting point and background is based on kind of the theory of sufficientarianism and a minimum threshold level of accessibility to key destinations, that everyone should be able to kind of have a certain standard of mobility or accessibility to meet their basic needs and be able to participate in society and achieve a high level of well-being. We've also tried to work into this definition the concept of vertical equity, that the transportation system should help to address systemic barriers. And so our policies should actually favor disadvantaged groups in order to compensate for overall inequities. So from a transportation perspective, many people living in low-income households, for example, can't afford a car, so are more dependent on transit and active transportation. Kind of in that context of the minimum level of accessibility, most people who do afford a car and can drive for transportation generally aren't below that minimum threshold. Also kind of on the horizontal equity, we did review the literature and are considering the kind of general trends about low-income areas being exposed to negative externalities. So noise, air pollution, heat, lack of shade, maybe less safe active transportation infrastructure, or worse transit service, though we haven't actually done that analysis for Ottawa. So some of the other principles and kind of starting points that we've worked into our transportation master plan, focusing on equity, the concept of mobility poverty, when not having access to a car, poor public transit options, or substandard walking and cycling infrastructure compounds other forms of social or economic disadvantage. And then we also took a socio-spatial approach. This is something that the official plan said that we are interested in, kind of a neighborhood-based approach to equity. And so we followed from that and identified priority neighborhoods that have high concentrations of residents who are socially and economically vulnerable and are therefore more likely to experience mobility poverty. So kind of if the same poor cycling conditions are in place in two neighborhoods, the priority neighborhood, that's more likely to create a significant barrier for many residents. Here is our map of priority neighborhoods. And we had, I think, the advantage of having an existing neighborhood equity tool that had been developed by some United Way and other nonprofit partners. And so we did talk about a lot of different approaches to kind of identifying the factors and mapping priority neighborhoods, and having another set of partners who had just gone through a rigorous process to do so gave us a good starting point. And kind of the details of exactly what we did, how we got from their map to ours, is in our background documentation. But I mean, I think the one thing that's probably interesting or relevant is that they had layered on transit scores and walk scores, and we felt that to avoid double counting, and what that did actually was that it flagged a lot of the rural neighborhoods as being areas of equity concern. Kind of Ottawa has a very large rural area, long distances between destinations, very low densities, and not a lot of transit or walking infrastructure. And since that is something we are already capturing in our transportation, kind of in past versions of the transportation master plan, we would have been thinking about rural transportation challenges and rural transit, and developing policies based on that. That the part we were missing was the kind of the social and economic dimension. So we ended up kind of pulling out low transit score and low walk score as factors that would influence these neighborhoods to avoid double counting. Other starting points that we felt were important to kind of state clearly that equity deserving groups are more likely to experience transportation related barriers. And we do, from the 2011 data, know that, for example, women are less likely to be auto drivers and are more likely to use transit or walk. They're also more likely to travel off-peak than men, particularly when traveling by transit. Low-income households are less likely to own cars and more likely to rely on transit, walking, and cycling. Women and children are less likely to cycle on facilities that are not separated from traffic. And barriers may be amplified considering intersectionality, so the overlap of different identities that may each create barriers. And while these points are sort of like generally well known, they hadn't been stated in the last TMP. And so we thought that kind of using the data and stating these clearly was an important starting point for talking about equity. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the policies and actions that speak to equity and how we want to remove barriers and advance equity. We have a policy about accelerating investments in TMP priority neighborhoods, and this is again kind of that idea that we want to overinvest in these neighborhoods relative to other neighborhoods from the vertical equity lens. We talk about refining public engagement processes to get better participation from equity deserving groups in priority neighborhoods. There's an action to develop a framework for monitoring transportation equity on an ongoing basis. And some of that will come from metrics from the TMP, but there will also be other kind of metrics and data analytics that we expect will go into that. Designing streets for all ages and abilities and backgrounds shows up in kind of different ways in different parts of the TMP, but kind of the equity dimension there is important. There's an action to review transit fare reductions for equity deserving groups. Transit affordability, obviously a major concern, a challenging one from a budget perspective, but worthy of review. Continuing to pursue affordable housing near transit stations and along frequent bus routes. Again, here the TMP overlaps with other city initiatives. Affordable housing is more the domain of the official plan and other strategies, but we again felt it was important to acknowledge the link, the importance of affordable housing from a transportation perspective in the TMP. Finally, the health link to equity is something we have embedded here. And so we speak to how health and equity connect, and then we also have some specific actions so that health is considered more explicitly in decision-making on transportation projects. We have sort of some very specific tools where we think we can add in public health as a dimension that influences decision-making so that we're getting kind of different decisions as we consider health. I've also pulled out kind of a selection from other sections of our transportation master plan. We have an action about shadeways and implementing shade along priority corridors, considering where are there urban heat islands, where are there equity concerns, where are there opportunities to add trees, and where is the existing tree canopy lacking. Winter maintenance has an equity dimension, and so there's an action to develop a priority pedestrian network for winter maintenance. Accessibility is something we work on kind of throughout our projects in a lot of ways, but continuing to address accessibility barriers in the built environment is obviously a focus of our transportation master plan. The group working on electric vehicle charging stations, they're in the climate change team, but they flagged that there may be an equity dimension of where we might need electric vehicle charging stations on streets, where the housing stock makes it harder for people to charge electric vehicles on site going forward. Rural transportation challenges are something that have an equity component as per our equity inclusion lens. And then as things like e-scooters and Ubers, Lyfts, and transportation network companies roll out, we talk about the importance of making sure that the city's regulating in a way that supports all of our objectives, including equity. Finally, we heard from our ambassadors working group that pedestrian security on streets is important. And our transit folks have given a lot of thought to crime prevention through environmental design, but it's not something that's really influenced our thinking a lot on street design. So there is an action to kind of delve into that a little bit deeper, working with equity-focused community partners and reviewing best practices in street design. So that's kind of the policy overview. I did want to share a bit about how we expect to consider equity as we actually kind of put money towards projects. So the active transportation candidate projects, it's kind of a big bucket of projects where we plan to go in and build new sidewalks or protected intersections or add cycle tracks. They were identified based on very extensive consultation like 4,000 pins dropped on a map, all of which were considered. And I think, so kind of a total of 92 plus 44 projects on the map. And I think the interesting piece here is how we incorporated the priority neighborhoods. So we did specifically review priority neighborhoods to identify pedestrian and cycling projects that would be needed. And kind of on the cycling side, kind of not just isolated projects, but how do we connect these neighborhoods into the network if they're not well connected? And that kind of extra lens of review is based on the strong possibility that priority neighborhoods would have been less likely to do our consultation. They're less likely to call their counselors and complain about existing conditions. And so we can't assume that that we know what their concerns are, even if in other neighborhoods we know exactly what that kind of like the top 5 requests are. We also made sure that our overall level of investment considered priority neighborhoods. So investing more heavily in priority neighborhoods relative to other neighborhoods. And then finally, how we phase the projects for implementation also matters. And so as we prioritize them, we'll make sure that the priority neighborhoods are considered. They won't necessarily all come first because there's other factors that are included as well, but it will be a kind of a significant weighting. Finally, we're just starting to talk about how we will consider equity as we evaluate road and transit projects. This is that part 2, cut the maps of rapid transit priority investments and road projects. Our kind of draft evaluation criteria, we have 4 of them that were in the draft policy document. And within the city building category, we expect to have an equity metric. And what we are currently talking about is that we could use our ME transportation model to model the expected number of transit riders using the project corridor who live in a priority neighborhood. And we would probably extract that down to city traffic zones, which provides a bit of a smaller unit of analysis than the census tracts that were that map I showed earlier. And so, I mean, the idea that if a project serves socially and economically vulnerable residents, it should have kind of a bit of a bump up in our scoring. Then on the road project side of things, many of the road projects are in suburban neighborhoods. But we are also talking about road projects that are more about complete street improvements in existing neighborhoods. And so our scoring, our draft, very early thinking is that a project might have a very positive impact on priority neighborhoods or a very negative impact on priority neighborhoods, and that our scoring rubric could reflect that. And I know we will leave questions to the end, but that's the end of what I wanted to share. Lots of work still to come.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Deborah, for your beautiful and wonderful presentation today. As Deborah mentioned, that we have separate Q&A sessions. So for those audiences questions that currently typing on the chat box, either we can basically reply back to you by typing the answers, or we will use that as a source for our questions during those Q&A sessions. Having said that, Sonia, this is your time for the second presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sonia Sanita, and thank you for the introductions. I'm very happy to partner with CIFL York on this speaker series and to co-moderate the session. And it is with great pleasure and gratitude to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Andréanne Doyon, Assistant Professor and Director of the Resource and Environmental Planning Program, School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University, who will be presenting on the topic of transport equity and climate action, a review of municipal plans in Canada. I'll just move to her bio now. Dr. Doyon holds a PhD in planning from the University of Melbourne. She is an assistant professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. Prior to SFU, she was a lecturer in sustainability and urban planning in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. She has published her work in cities, sustainability and environmental innovations and societal transitions, as well as in edited books. Beyond academic publications, she has also written technical reports, news articles for The Conversation and The Guardian, and participated in numerous public events as a speaker or chair. Her current research focuses on urban governance and planning for low carbon and climate just cities, sustainable housing, and questions of justice and sustainability transitions. She is particularly interested in understanding processes of change related to sustainability outcomes. Welcome, Dr. Doyon. We look forward to your presentations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, 1 second. Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about transport equity, but much more from a climate action perspective, and thinking about, or I guess, sharing with you what I've learned in terms of some research we've done around municipal climate action plans in Canada. But before that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm located in a different territory than the York region today. So I'm coming to you from the Coast Salish territories, which are comprised of the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsalechites. So I just want to pay my gratitude to the host nations here. As a settler, I'm an uninvited guest here. So just wanted to acknowledge that. And I think it's really important that we think about where we are when we're thinking about questions of equity and transport and mobility, because where we get around is connected to the land, and that land has different history and meaning to different folks. So it's important to do that. As well, I use pronouns she, her. And again, I think it's important that we understand, acknowledge, and embed different ways of knowing and being, and our own positionalities and intersecting identities impact the way that we experience and use transport choices, as well as the people that we're planning for. So it's important that we sort of carry that through the work that we do, and for me, sort of the research and teaching that I do as well. So for my presentation, I'm going to kind of split it up into 2 parts. One, I'm going to share with you some of the work we've done in terms of the review of how equity is incorporated into municipal climate action plans across Canada. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the connection to transport, because that's why we're here today. But I'm going to provide a bit of a background on how we did that research, and again, some of the key findings or some of the exciting things that came out from a transport perspective. And then I'm going to shift into sort of thinking much more from a proactive or application perspective, and share with you some of my thoughts and sort of my research group's findings on how you might actually integrate equity into your transport plans. And it's really great that I think Deborah went first, because Deborah highlighted some of the pieces that we talked about, and we might provide some ways of doing that, or different ways of thinking about some of those questions. So I look forward to the Q&A session. So in terms of the research of looking at equity in municipal climate action plans, we were really interested in sort of just taking almost like a temperature check. So what is happening? Who is thinking about justice and equity when they're thinking about responding to climate change? So we really wanted to look at who was doing this, how they were doing it, but in particular, we were interested in who cities, municipalities, regions, who was intentionally incorporating equity into climate plans. So I'll share with you kind of how we found this list of intentional integration, but that's really the core of it. So again, we were asking, how is equity being incorporated into municipal and city action plans across Canada? So why were we interested in looking at equity in terms of climate action? And it really comes from a sort of place of being interested in climate justice. So, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. So it comes from a place of thinking about and acknowledging the costs and benefits of a changing climate. So thinking about all the different types of impacts that different types of regions and individuals and communities face as a result of our changing climate. So we need to be thinking about the responsibility to act in responding to climate change, But we also need to acknowledge that the ability to respond to climate change is not evenly distributed, both locally and globally. So climate justice tells us that most often the negative impacts are felt by the people who are already experiencing different forms of marginalization and vulnerabilities. So they are most likely associated with people who have lower socioeconomic status, racialized minorities, folks with disabilities, or who are otherwise systematically disadvantaged or equity deserving groups. So we know that these are the groups who fare the worst when we're thinking about climate impacts. So it's really important that we're thinking about how we respond, both from a mitigation and an adaptation perspective, that we're thinking about who's winning and who's losing in these processes, who has the ability to respond and to withstand these shocks, and who doesn't, and to think accordingly. And here are 3 questions that I like to ask myself, and I like to pose particularly to practitioners that I work with. Are your actions, so particularly in this case, we're thinking about climate actions and initiatives, but are your actions leading to more equitable outcomes? Are they creating new inequities or exacerbating existing ones? And here's the big one: how would you know? How would you know that your actions, initiatives, programs, policies are actually leading to more equitable outcomes or not? And I think that was really great that Deborah ended on that note, really thinking about how do we evaluate this? How do we think about the impact of the work that we've had and all sort of the many, many years that has gone into the transport plan? How do you know that you've actually made an impact in terms of equity and inclusion? And this is so important, and it's often a point that is not given much attention at sort of the local government level when we're thinking about a lot of plans and policies. There's always sort of the new thing to work on, and we don't spend a lot of time reflecting and evaluating on the work. So how did we do this work? So we actually started with over 500 jurisdictions across Canada. And we first looked at jurisdictions that had declared a climate emergency and looked to see had they declared a climate emergency and then had they actually gone on to complete the climate action plan. Then there were other cities, particularly in Western Canada and the prairies, who had not declared a climate emergency, because that's generally not a practice or action that was done in that region of Canada. But we know that many of those major cities still had a climate action plan. So we also included those in our list. From those, we refined that sort of list. So we first looked at who has climate action plans. We found 54 of those. We refined it by looking at plans that were available in English, and this is primarily because my research team were not fluent in French. I am, but they're not, so we needed to make sure that we could all access the material. We wanted them to be written after 2014, and that number might seem arbitrary, but it sort of does signify a different vibe or a different type of climate action plan. And we wanted plans to be complete. So some folks might sort of go, hold on, we've got a climate action plan. We didn't want plans that were in draft form. We wanted to look at plans that were complete, to really sort of the plans are what they are, and that's what's meant to be implemented. So of those 24 plans, we then looked for explicit mentions of words. Did the plans include equity, equitable, inclusive, inclusivity, justice, reconciliation, and so forth? So we're really interested in looking at the language that was used in it. And then how those words or those themes were then connected to other equity-related categories, things like jobs or economy, Indigenous relations, urban greenery, food security, health, and so on. So we wanted to know how were they talking about equity, inclusivity, and justice within their plans. So this is sort of you don't need at all to be able to look at the detail of this, but this just kind of gives you a sense of our process of how we begin to map out. So on your left, this just shows it counts. How many times were these words included in the plans? And also, was there a definition? I love that Ottawa actually is saying when we use the word equity, what we mean is, because what we found is actually most of the plans that we looked at, they didn't include equity. In fact, only 3 plans actually had definitions of equity, and 2 of those were in the glossary. So we only had 1 city that up front in the introduction said, this is what we mean by equity. So it's really important that if you're going to talk about transport equity, and if you're going to talk about climate justice, that you tell us what you mean. It helps, I think, practitioners and staff within cities to understand what they're working towards, but it also helps residents to hold governments accountable to what they said they're going to do. If you don't tell us what you mean, we don't know if you've done it. Again, how do we know that these actions have actually had the impact that we wanted? And then the other one on the right just shows the types of categories we're looking at, and just doing a kind of a simple, is this included? Yes, no. And then sort of later on, we looked at how, but this allowed us to dwindle the list down to these 8 cities. So we have 8 cities in Canada that at the time of our study, which was in 2021, had complete plans that were available in English and that were newer than 2014. So we have Saanich, BC, which is on Vancouver Island, City of Vancouver, Winnipeg, Markham, Toronto, Windsor, Montreal, and Halifax. So again, this is not to say that other cities are not incorporating equity in other work that they're doing. It's not to say that other cities aren't doing equity in transport, as we've heard Ottawa is, but these are cities that we specifically looked at their climate action plans. So I just want to make sure that people don't go, hold on, why am I not here? Is because we were looking at a very specific type of plan or strategy. But I really would encourage you to have a look at these 8 plans for yourselves if it's something that you're working on in your own work, to see how have they done this. So we drew on the work of 2 other sort of scholarly publications that had done previous work on equity in resilience and climate plans. So we used these sort of the existing criteria that they had used to study these 8 plans in more depth. So again, we looked again at those definitions of equity, but also looking for mention of equity targets, milestones, and timelines. Because the thing with equity in these kinds of plans is that they're rarely measured. And that old saying goes, we can only manage what we measure. So if we're not taking count of this stuff, we also can't answer my questions around how do we know if we've made an impact. But it also sort of helps to show the emphasis or the importance that jurisdictions are actually placing on equity. We've made note of, when the plan was created, what was its purpose, and if it had any other mention or connection, explicit mention or connection to other documents, strategies, and plans within the organizations or the municipality, as well as explicit mention of other organizations that they're working with. And again, we were interested in sort of if they were upfront and how they were evaluating their own work. And then we conducted semi-structured interviews with 7 of them. We tried really hard to get Markham, but we just couldn't get them. So Markham, if you're on the call today, I'd love to hear from you so we could follow up and find out a little bit more from your perspective on how you incorporated equity into your climate plan. So what we found, I want to share 3 sort of key areas that stood out for us, and then a general sort of what we saw was done kind of across the plans. First finding is that there was a connection between land use. So thinking about sort of more traditional urban planning and thinking about transport and equity together. So here are examples from the city of Vancouver, Montreal, and the city of Saanich. So in Vancouver, they have an action specifically connected to what they're calling a big move of walkable complete neighborhoods. But here they're saying that they want to make low-cost sustainable transport options easy, safe, and reliable, so that people can get to work, school, and other destinations without feeling they need to rely on gas or diesel vehicles and that the noise and pollution that they produce. But interesting, again, to pick up some of the themes that Deborah talked about, easy and safe. Safety is something that is important as well, reliable. So are opportunities available to you. Within Montreal, there's a really strong desire to integrate the climate emergency into existing strategies. So the city was at the same time developing their urban planning strategy, so they're equivalent to their official plan, as well as their transport strategy. And there was a recommendation that came out of the climate plan to make sure that the climate emergency was at the center, was part of the way that they understood planning and transport. And here they want to enhance land use planning and regulation tools to favor the development of districts that are more human scale and they adapt to climate change. So I think, again, interesting to think about human scale as a way to understand how people exist in cities and get around. But also I really like, as a planner, the emphasis on the use of land use planning, regulation, and tools. We have municipalities. One of the things that is the most powerful tool in a municipal government's toolbox is land use planning. There's almost like it's the main thing that they have jurisdiction over is how they manage land. So you can manage land differently to support climate transport outcomes. And then the city of Saanich as well is interested in expanding cycling and walking infrastructure, as well as improving sort of end of trip facilities, which is really important to kind of create that whole loop to not just going, hey, you can bike, but what does it look like from start to finish of that trip? And to create stronger integration between different transport methods. So thinking much more from a multimodal transport perspective and making sure that that is affordable and accessible to a wider variety of people. Saanich, again, Saanich was what I called my wild card. I had no idea that Saanich was doing so many amazing things. But for those of you who've never heard of Saanich before, it's a suburb to Victoria on Vancouver Island. And they're really, I think, moving the conversation forward. They are the only plan that actually had a definition of equity up front. So here I want to talk about how Saanich thought about doing engagement when it came to their climate action plan. So they turned to the International Association of Public Participation, also referred to as IAP2, guidelines to think about the different ways of engagement. So the IAP2 has a spectrum where on one end of the scale is informed, so you're telling people about something, and at the opposite end, you're not just sort of engaging and collaborating, but you're actually helping to empower citizens and residents to help to create the future of where they live, to really think about sort of giving them the right to the city. Right to the city, we often think about, do you have the capacity to shape the place where you live? And that helps to sort of give people rights. So they had really specific engagement efforts. In particular, they contacted Chinese seniors groups that meet regularly because they knew that was a specific target audience that previously they had missed. And they made sort of use of thinking about different organizations like the Vancouver Island Immigrant and Refugee Society, speaking to local First Nations. But from a transport perspective, what they did is they rode the bus. They got people to ride the bus days in, days out with surveys to gain a more diverse respondents to better understand how people understood the climate emergency, but also how they could participate in what would sort of impact their lives. So sometimes simple things like that can help to reach out to people that you wouldn't normally reach out to, folks that normally wouldn't go to a public meeting or sort of an info session, but it's really important to hear from these voices, and why not do it in the place that you're wanting to have that major impact, somewhere like transit. Two other transportation initiatives coming from Toronto and Winnipeg have to do with free bicycle repair workshops. So here's really thinking about increasing the capacity of residents to participate in more sustainable forms of transport and to have the skills needed to maintain that. So Toronto has the bicycle repair hubs program, where Winnipeg has a program called Wrench. And again, the aim of these programs is to give residents access, knowledge, and experience to begin cycling, to make it more accessible for a variety of different folks. And in particular, these programs tend to be targeting towards more lower socioeconomic communities, and to help them to engage in a more low carbon commute, again, while giving them the skills to cycle, to fix their bikes, and to participate or practice a new form of transport commuting. And again, the emphasis is on increasing capacity and helping to get people involved. What they also found is it actually helped to also create community and social capital within these programs. So thinking a different way to do this. I will say though, what was the norm across the plans, I wanted to highlight sort of three, what I thought was interesting ways that equity and transport was being talked about. The norm was much more focused on a geographic understanding. Where are infrastructure, where are services and infrastructure, and also thinking, how do we increase numbers? So City of Vancouver, 50% of the population in the City of Vancouver commutes by active transport, so transit, walking, or cycling. And as part of the climate action plan, they want to increase that to 75%. Great. Why something like that isn't included from an equity perspective is because they don't tell us who. Great. Currently, 50% of residents commute this way. You want more people to commute this way. Do you know why that 50% isn't? Do you know who is or not participating in these ways? So unless you're actually digging into, again, those issues of intersecting identities and different and thinking about access and capacity and safety, you're not going to get the whole picture. So you're just throwing out numbers, but you're not actually, again, thinking about the data being collected to manage and measure equity. So how might you integrate equity into your transport plans? So this is building off of partly the work that we did looking at the climate action plans, but also some of the other work I do thinking about equity and environmental planning more generally across a variety of spectrums. But again, how might you do this? I wanted to talk about sort of different ways that we might think about equity. Again, it's so important that we define what we mean. In a similar sort of image to what Deborah used, but kind of taking it one step further as well and thinking about not just about providing people with equitable treatment, but what if we actually removed barriers to being involved and to be able to participate. But an oldie but a goodie, in 1981, Lucy identified 5 different approaches that planners can take to incorporate and to address equity. And I think it's important that you sort of think about what your municipality or what you're doing in your work, what kind of equity are you really working towards? So a more equality approach is where all goods and services are distributed equally. So we would just think about having, making sure that there is bike lanes everywhere, just everywhere, regardless of who lives where. A needs-based approach is, again, thinking much more from the City of Ottawa's priority perspective and thinking about where do people need this service or this piece of infrastructure and making sure that they get that. A demand-based approach is when people are asking for it. So who use a certain service and are they requesting or even complaining about a good or service that they want to see? So we tend to see this often in more vocal neighborhoods that have higher social capital and often just more resources, including time on their hands. And they also know how to navigate local government politics. A preference-driven approach is where the public opinion is taken into consideration. So you're thinking about getting sort of a take on what's the public interest and then making a decision that way versus a willingness to pay approach. So only those who can, people pay for the ability to use a service or piece of infrastructure. And these are all actually different ways to think about equity and equality. Another way that I like to think about this is through dimensions and thinking about the different types of equity work we mean and the different ways we can engage in this and define this. So from an academic perspective, because I am an academic, scholars have been engaging in this question for decades now. So really thinking about how do we do this? How do we plan for equitable, just, and sustainable cities? How can we engage in this work? How can we get practitioners to do this work? And how can we evaluate this work? So while there's been a variety of different sort of disciplinary or sort of areas of scholarship that have engaged with this, most of the literature tends to touch on 3 forms of equity or justice, and they are distributive, procedural, and recognition. And we'll go through them now. So the first one is distribution or distributional. And I have 2 definitions here because it is defined in a variety of different ways. And so I wanted you to kind of be able to think about it in different ways. But we can think about distribution equity as the distribution of benefits, things like resources and opportunities, and costs, harms and risks associated with a particular decision, action, or change. So we can think about it, the goods and bads of something, an equitable distribution, but we can also think about it as an equitable distribution of goods, infrastructure, services, and opportunities across the city. So again, we're thinking about how are these different infrastructures and services being distributed across a particular area. So examples can be location and types of cycling infrastructure. I know here I live in the city of Vancouver, and in my neighborhood, which is a lower socioeconomic neighborhood with a very high diverse population, we don't have any separated bike lanes. The separated bike lanes tend to be in wealthier neighborhoods and neighborhoods that have undergone more change in terms of major redevelopments and zonings. Often, so that's sort of an example of a way to think about what kinds of services are available where. And public transportation, again, is a big one, thinking about accessibility, availability, reliability, frequency, safety, things like that. So we're thinking about where is that happening. And I would say the examples of thinking about land use planning and equity in transport would really fit very well with this idea of a distributional approach to equity. So really thinking about it from a geographic, spatial perspective. Procedural is really thinking about inclusive and equitable participation in planning and decision-making processes. It helps us to get to the questions of the nature of decision-making around governance, including the level of participation, inclusiveness, and influence participants can actually wield. So we're thinking of not just engaging with people, but what does that engagement look like? And again, thinking about that spectrum, are we informing or are we actually moving towards collaborating and even potentially empowering communities? So examples of this can include getting citizens to participate in plan development, different types of outreach activities, particularly targeting equity deserving communities, and also things like citizen-led initiatives. So thinking about the programs that we heard about in terms of the bicycle repair. So examples here would be Saanich riding the bus would be an example of procedural equity, but also the bike repairs would also be an example of this as well. The last form of justice or equity that's commonly used is recognition. So it's an acknowledgement and respect of different equity denied or equity deserving communities. And it's an acknowledgement and respect for the rights, needs, values, understandings, customs of the groups involved or affected by decision-making and governance. Another way to think of recognition and justice is also that recognizing current and past injustices that different individuals and communities have served. So we can think about colonial legacy, systemic racism as being things that we need to recognize in the way that we engage in our work. So again, recognizing different groups' histories and needs is really important when we're thinking about how we engage with people and how we're making decisions in terms of where things are happening. So we need to be thinking about, and examples include activities that cater to the needs of very specific equity deserving groups, such as those with disabilities, cultural or religious minorities, and so on. So really thinking about being explicit and not having sort of a larger swath definition. Some municipalities like to use things like disproportionately impacted communities or just a general equity deserving groups. But what does that really mean? Who are you including in those definitions? Recognition is really about sort of digging into those subsets of identities that exist. And the bicycle repair programs are also another example of recognition. It would be an example of something that sort of crosses both procedural and recognition forms of justice. And now how might we actually apply this? So it's great to hear about some theory, I'm sure, and not everyone thought that they were going to get a little lecture in that from a academic at this, at your lunch hour. But it's important, again, that we define what we mean. If we're not actually being explicit with what kind of equity we mean, what our goals are, and how we might measure those, it's going to be really challenging to work towards that and actually make the change that we want to see to lead to a more equitable and just, sustainable city. So GIS suitability analysis maps allow us to integrate these different forms of equity into a more practical application that is something that many of you are probably already using in your work. So again, they're used in a variety of different planning processes, anything from transport to green infrastructure, to housing need, to social services. But you want to make them, and I think this is again where Deborah highlighted the importance of making sure that it fits with what you're working on. So how is this related to a transport plan rather than other things? Because sometimes these different types of maps exist across city departments, but it's making sure that you incorporate and adapt it to your needs. But there's an opportunity to integrate equity related layers into existing municipal maps and tools that you might have. And here are some of the equity variables that we would really encourage folks to consider in their work. And I want to say it's very important that you understand these as separate layers. It is not a disproportionately impacted layer. It is not an equity deserving layer. It is about thinking about what kinds of projects you're working on, what kinds of initiatives you have, and how you want to target those in different ways. So you want to make sure that all of these different variables have their own layer. So again, I really like that Ottawa focused on areas of thinking about past investment, priority areas and things like that. So where is growth taking place, but also where have past capital investments taken place? So again, using the city of Vancouver, because this is where I am, there is a long history of continuing to invest in the same areas. So I mentioned, some neighborhoods have designated bike paths. Those are also the same neighborhoods that have all the fancy new stormwater management and green rainwater infrastructure as well. You tend to see a lot of those areas having many of these new additions. You want to identify different racialized populations, and again, have a separate variable for each group. Minority populations and racialized populations are not the same. It is important that we understand the differences across those. Foreign-born individuals is also another way to understand differences across your population. Recent immigrants, people who have moved within the last 5 years, employment rate, adults without a high school education, people receiving government transfer payments, owner to renter ratio, to give you an insight. And this is actually something where Deborah talked about sort of thinking about EV charging. We see this actually as being something that happens. We can often see things like this between an owner to renter ratio. We see a lot neighborhoods with a higher ownership rate have more EV charging stations nearby. And it's a lot harder for renters to have more accessible access to those types of infrastructure. People living alone, people under the age of 5 or 6, but also you can, I think I don't have this here, but also I would say the opposite, people over the age of 65. Dependency ratio, so thinking about how many people are within a youth or a senior's age group. Looking at female and non-binary populations, again, as separate variables, and people with disabilities. And you could continue to add to this, but it's important that this is recognized, because again, if we want to evaluate our work and if we want to understand what we're trying to do, we need to have baseline data. And in our work on the climate action plans, what we found is that most municipalities are not collecting this kind of information and are not using this kind of disaggregated demographic data to actually shape and push the work that they're doing. So it's really important that you use as much data is available to you, and where there are gaps in those data, that you do the work to fill it, so you can provide yourself with the baseline information to then be able to make more informed, more equity-informed decisions in how you're moving forward, and then be able to evaluate those decisions and outcomes. So I want to leave you again with these 3 questions, and I really hope that you can kind of think of them as a mantra in the work that you do. Are your policies and programs leading to more equitable outcomes? Or are they creating new inequities or exacerbating existing inequities? And how would you know? And I look forward to chatting with you more about this in the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Doyon, for sharing this wonderful, informative presentation and for sharing with us this excellent research. And I love those 3 questions. They're phenomenal. Thank you for highlighting them. We will now move into questions, beginning with questions for Deborah. And I believe there are several in the Q&A already. And then once those are completed, we'll move to questions for Dr. Doyon. Thank you.
All right. So my understanding is that this is time that we can share for both Deborah as well as Andréanne to answer for already produced some of the questions in the chat box. And then Deborah also answered to a couple of questions already. So I'd like to avoid those questions that Deborah had answered through those chat box. And I'm going to focus on the remaining questions so that we can have more answers for more questions. So Deborah, I think Andréanne asked very interesting questions. I believe that everybody can see what he asked. So his question was that as we are focusing on distributing EV cars as much as we can, and obviously those cars such as, let's say, Tesla car is a quite expensive car. So if we are trying to focusing on building those EV charging stations, then it may not necessarily help on this equity issue. So I guess that, Deborah, this is your opportunity to address those questions.
Sure, and it's a great question, and I'll admit I don't have a fulsome answer to it. Our colleagues in our climate change team are leading some work on what they're calling a personal vehicle electrification strategy, and our climate change mitigation community transition plan called Energy Evolution has kind of an aggressive target for EV uptake, and the person working on this strategy, their role is to think about what are the leverage points the city has. Obviously, federal standards, provincial roles, a lot of different players can help to drive electric vehicle uptake. So what can the city do? And the equity question kind of front and center at the same time of how do we make sure that everyone can benefit. The only part that shows up in the transportation master plan is this question of electric vehicle charging stations on city streets. And so that is where, linked to the point about renters versus owners, I'd reference like the housing stock where you have a lot of older multi-residential buildings and we don't yet have programs to help property owners install EV charging stations, though that maybe is another area that are where the city could do something so that people can have on-site charging stations at their home. Kind of as it now stands, the piece that got into the TMP was where on let's map the priority locations where we expect to need EV charging stations on city streets, and that's a future action that I think will generate a lot of conversations, including what else do we need to do? This isn't enough.
Thank you, Deborah, for answering your questions, but it may be challenging if we simply focusing on expanding those EV charging stations for individuals, I guess, transportation mode, like just Tesla car or those cars. But nevertheless, my understanding is that the city could potentially focus more on building those EV charging stations targeting, let's say, public transits. In Toronto, for example, TTC is currently converting, they're spending a lot of budget to purchase EV public transits. And then I think that, let's say, city's effort for building EV charging stations toward those bus system could indirectly helping this equity issue under the umbrella of those electric vehicles expansion plan as well. So that's my personal view. Second question also asked by Kyle. He mentions that since we are all living in, let's say, Canada, obviously in the winter season, no matter what, the willingness for using active transportation like bicycles outside, let's say, weather condition is not necessarily helping us to use bicycles. In Ontario, as an example, when we are cleaning those roadways, we are cleaning, let's say, arterials first, freeway first, and then later on local roadways. We are not necessarily looking into the equity issue when we are prioritizing the sequence of those roadway cleaning. So perhaps, Deborah, you can answer if there are any future plans to change those prioritization in terms of winter clearance.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe the first thing I'll mention is that we do also have a winter cycling network in Ottawa. It was brought into effect with the last transportation master plan. We kind of first started clearing a network in and around downtown in 2015, and the new TMP has some direction to expand that. In the past, we only had one downtown network, and with our significant investment in light rail, we would establish winter cycling networks around rapid transit stations outside the downtown core. And my thought and hope is that some of those winter cycling networks that are kind of in the outer urban area, that is also where we have many of the priority neighborhoods. So that would also be a factor that we would consider, making sure that all of our winter cycling networks aren't only, but that they span all neighborhoods, and that we cover priority neighborhoods as well. The pedestrian network, I do not think we are currently considering a policy like we've seen in some of the other, I think maybe it was Norway, there was a city that cleared all active transportation facilities first and road second, and said, like, the cars will wait, the people will walk and bike first. I would love to say we are putting that in our draft transportation master plan, but that we are not there yet as far as I can tell. But so this item about the priority pedestrian network is less about, there might be a bit of a kind of reallocation of funding and priority from roads to sidewalks. But I mean, I think the biggest piece is within the pedestrian network, making sure that it used to be that, the sidewalk would get cleared at the same time as the road. If it's an important road, it must be an important sidewalk. We're trying to add a little more kind of pedestrian focused routes, so that routes to school, routes to transit stations, even if they're local roads, would get cleared first. So that pedestrian focus in terms of our order of clearing.
All right, thank you very much, Deborah. I'd like to use my last opportunity for asking you the question. Then I will let Sonia to help Dr. Doyon asking for other questions. So I do have also very, I guess, fundamental questions that you may or may not have the answers. Obviously, a lot of transportation equity relating project, if we strictly applying, let's say, economic appraisal, like benefit and cost analysis, most of the cases, the size of cost is going to be a lot greater than the benefit that entire, I guess, society may obtain based upon traditional approach. So how would a city of Ottawa is going to produce a sustainable solution in the future, then knowing that, again, still you need to secure the budget over the next long-term years to make sure that this transportation project under the lens of this equity can be sustainable over the long term. So do you have any special idea or plan ahead?
We don't use cost benefit analysis in our transportation master plan. We are currently working on an evaluation framework that considers costs, but that also has kind of points in a separate criteria for equity, city building, support for sustainable modes, avoiding induced demand. And so we'll be consulting on that soon. And if anyone wants to do our consultation when that comes live, probably in about 4 weeks, we'll be excited, because it is so important that kind of these tools that sometimes get put in, Appendix C to the TMP dictate what we build, where do we put those millions of dollars. And in the last TMP, there was not a reshuffling of funding between modes. I think we kind of took, the last TMP had this bucket for roads, this bucket for transit, this bucket for walking, this bucket for cycling, kind of carried that forward. This time around, with our climate change mitigation targets, we will be looking at different scenarios of what if we build more transit, walking, and cycling and much less on the road side? What does it take to actually achieve? They're quite ambitious climate change targets, that require big mode shifts. So identifying what do we actually have to do to achieve those targets? And interesting conversations will happen for sure. Like it will be controversial. It will be politically, it will go to the politicians for decision making, which kind of as it should. And again, because that modeling of what does it take to meet our climate change targets, it included things like congestion pricing. It included things like transit service frequency changes, increasing the frequency of buses and LRT, which have not traditionally been in the realm of a transportation master plan. But I think we are going to be bringing those things kind of like up to the forefront, in that many of the measures are interdependent. Your congestion pricing drives your transit ridership. So if you do A without B, you only get 40% mode share. If you do A plus B, you get a 55% mode share, and kind of really understanding what it takes.
Once again, thank you very much, Deborah and Lightman, for your wonderful presentation, as well as excellent answers for many questions. Now, Sonia, this is your chance for leading the questions for Dr. Doyon.
Sure. We have a question from Timothy in the Q&A. He notes that transport infrastructure investment can raise property values and lead to gentrification. It's actually a question for both of our panelists. How can we prevent low-income renters from being priced out of their neighborhoods?
First, I'll just say, Timothy, great question. I think it's really important from a transport equity perspective. I also feel a little bit nervous answering this, knowing that Todd Lightman's on the call, as someone who has much longer transport expertise and experience than myself. But this might sound like an obvious answer, but it's an answer that I like to give whenever people ask questions like this, is what if we actually had an equitable transportation strategy? As in, what if we actually just had better transport options everywhere? Would we be so concerned with the different neighborhoods being changing or certain residents being priced out if transport was actually truly accessible to everybody. And I know that that sounds obvious, but I actually really, we see this a lot within like sort of the green gentrification, sort of conversations as well. Well, if we put too many parks in lower socioeconomic areas, will it, sort of rise the price and push people out? But what if everyone had access to parks and that becomes the norm? Because the truth is everyone should have access to safe, reliable, sustainable transportation options. And if we had this across our cities, I think we'd be less likely to increase the chances of gentrification, particularly in these lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. So I really would like us to kind of flip the switch and not go, oh, we shouldn't do it in those neighborhoods, but actually we should do it everywhere. But maybe there's an opportunity to think about prioritizing and the different modes in a way that is equity informed. So I think that's an important take.
Thank you, Dr. Doyon. Deborah, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think I can fully answer the question, but I can tell you kind of the 2.5-pronged approach that the City of Ottawa is taking. And there was another question about how we implement that policy about continuing to pursue affordable housing near rapid and high quality transit. So the city did go through an exercise of reviewing publicly owned properties that would be good candidates for redevelopment as affordable housing. And if you've been to the City of Ottawa, it is not very dense. There are parking lots all around our brand new multi-billion-dollar LRT station. So there is a lot of opportunity for intensification and including kind of city-owned properties that could be redeveloped. So they identified a set of candidate properties, and they were supposed to develop, we, the City of Ottawa, are to be developing a strategy to redevelop those publicly owned properties as affordable housing. And I'm not in that group, but I do think that kind of public pressure is needed to keep that moving. And that's why, again, we put it in the TMP. Let's reemphasize we've got this strategy. We haven't seen a lot happening since 2019. How are we actually going to redevelop these properties? We also have inclusionary zoning in our new official plan, which is new. And again, I think the devil is in the details in terms of how that gets implemented. And then we've had calls for an anti-displacement policy from some of our community advocates. I think that's under review again by other groups. But I mean, those 3 tools are valuable, if not perfect, from my understanding.
I'll just add, and again, I support all that. Like, again, one of the things I said in my presentation is municipalities actually have control over land, and think about what you can actually do with land. So inclusionary zoning is a really great thing. Thinking about developing public owned land, really great as well. Thinking about the types of bylaws, guidelines that you put on that, thinking about rezoning proposals and what you're asking for. In British Columbia, folks may or may not know, but the provincial government has just sort of put forward a new sort of proposal to have control to be able to rezone land around transportation stations to be able actually to increase housing and other types of services and opportunities that people need to have close by. So where we have certain transportation-oriented development goals, actually across the region in Metro Vancouver, some of those are really underutilized in terms of actually increasing housing density or increasing access to sort of new schools, new types of healthcare services and like that. So now the province is saying that they want the opportunity to actually have the control to rezone those specifically within a sort of space around that. And again, connected to sort of that question of affordability as well.
Thank you for the excellent joint response. Just one more question for Dr. Doyon. In your research, was there any reference to the equity aspects of climate change impacts on transportation infrastructure and their implications for equity-seeking groups?
I will say yes and no. Looking at the looking at the climate action plans, for the most part, no, they don't talk about like what happens when we have a heat wave or we have a snowstorm. and our transportation stopped working. So when I used to live in Melbourne and it would get really, really hot, the trains would stop working. So it would get so hot in the summers that the train tracks could not handle the trains going on it because they would begin to sort of warp. So that means everyone who depended on trains to get around could not get around. Here in Canada, and I can say in Metro Vancouver, when we get snow, everything stops because we rarely get snow and everyone makes fun of us because we can't handle it. But there is not the systems in place to actually plow snow. The strategy for the most part is just wait till it melts. So you have lots and lots of people who rely on transit systems who don't operate. So we know that this is a major problem, that there are large demographics of people who rely solely on transport, active transport or transit to get around, and they are completely shut off during climatic events. I did not see any plans that actively responded or were planning for those things in terms of thinking about, are equity deserving communities worse off when these things cut off? It is something that I've been talking to and with municipal governments here in the Lower Mainland about. How can we prepare for extreme weather events? And what does that look like for our infrastructure, for our transportation, things like that. So my sense is it's on their mind, but I'm not actually seeing it in plans yet, not explicitly.
Thank you for the response, Dr. Doyon. I think that is what we have in terms of questions. Let me just take a look, see if there's anything else. Okay, we actually have another, one more question. Wondering whether goods delivery services have been considered in the transportation equity, and in case it is not considered, what do you think? How should we incorporate that? From Tanvir.
I think that's a Deborah question.
So the truck route network in Ottawa is a very hot topic and controversial. We have trucks, interprovincial trucks traveling through our downtown to get from Highway 417 across to Gatineau in Quebec. And one of the major regional transportation challenges is, what do we do about this? Do we build another bridge? Do we build a tunnel under downtown? Are there kind of softer approaches with restrictions and rerouting? And I think the equity component of what we do about that will be kind of an important thing to consider. I guess in general, kind of truck routes and equity, because we update the truck route network so infrequently, it's something that certainly wouldn't have been considered the last time around. But next time we do it, we absolutely should think about that. And then I think the other piece that has an equity component, as we look to promote electric, smaller vehicles, cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes, and that obviously has citywide benefits, but perhaps has particular benefits for people walking, cycling, using transit, and perhaps in neighborhoods if there are kind of particular truck impacts in priority neighborhoods. It's a great question. I'll have to think about it some more, actually. And if you have any ideas, if anyone, if there was a thought behind that you think would be worth sharing, please share it in the chat. There was also a question about microtransit in the context of rural transportation for first last mile trips. And it is something that shows up in our draft TMP to explore on-demand transit's the main focus, though kind of fairly closely linked to microtransit. We also have some kind of automated shuttle pilots that are happening, being promoted. Our transit planners are not terribly optimistic about microtransit, on-demand transit outside of kind of in the lower density rural areas. this is not my area of expertise, but from their initial analysis, even in suburban areas, the kind of the equation doesn't quite work out from what they are seeing. Again, it probably depends what inputs, what are your parameters, how much are you willing to spend? Are you trying to make it the same as conventional transit? So I think there's both kind of like the how do you approach the question and what is the answer? But I mean, I think we'd be starting with that focus in the existing transit service area to try to make transit better where we have the highest potential transit ridership. The rural areas outside of villages, kind of as a policy direction, we don't provide transit. Again, with kind of the citywide lens of affordability and maximizing the value of dollars. And when someone chooses to live outside of a village and outside of the urban area, they know that their property tax bill is different because they're not in the transit service area.
Thank you so much. That leaves us a couple minutes left. Thank you to all the participants for your wonderful questions, and thanks again to our panelists. And I will pass it over just for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, everybody, especially our participants. I should mention that among us are professional experts, planners, directors, managers of transportation related, as well as planning from cities, municipalities from across Canada, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other places. We thank you all for joining, and thank you for this very informative session. Deborah and Andréanne, it was so informative, and the answer to questions was really good. We appreciate that. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the research and work that you are doing, both in practice and academia. I just want to bring to your attention that first, our next session will be on 2 weeks from now, Wednesday, April 27. At same time, same link. We will be having great presentations again, moderated by Professor Patricia Wood, as well as presenter Todd Lightman and Mahood, which will be we are looking forward to hear from them as well in 2 weeks' time. I also should finish with this thought. All these sessions are recorded, so if you want to come back and or if you miss this opportunity to listen to this, you can come back and watch the recording in the same website as we publish all the materials related to the presentations, of course, with permission from the speaker. Thank you all again, and looking forward to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Sharon, for helping organizing this session. And Tia also from York region.